diverse set of behaviours.
He Māori aho.
Your single source of truth.
The words don't pull it for me.
My husband is Samoan, so talofa. Ngā tikanga reo, tikitahi.
Che Guevara of New Zealand's Parliament, Chloe Slaughter.
Penny houses.
And it's communist.
He Atatū, Putin.
They've got mother, running holidays.
Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora.
Nau mai, hara mai, whakatau mai rā. Welcome to the All Report, episode 4. My name is Pere Huriwai-seger, and I'm joined by my beautiful wife and co-host, Samah Huriwai-seger.
Hi, everyone.
Hope everyone's doing well. There's lots to talk about. The main things that we want to cover, updates around what's happening in Rarotonga. And of course, we're going to be talking about Destiny's Church and their appalling, shocking behavior around what happened at the Te Atatū library. And of course, the disruption of the Pride Parade. And Samah is going to be doing our weekly Parliamentary Unpack as well.
Parliament Unpacked, it's called.
Parliament Unpacked.
It's the working title anyway.
We need a theme song and some labels and stuff like that as well.
Yeah.
And a special thank you to our comment admins that are here looking after the comment section. We would really like to, work on the community aspect of Aotearoa Liberation League. We've generated somewhat of a platform, and now we're wondering what can we do in terms of the community aspects. How can we bring our like-minded people together to share in our thoughts and grow our community? So everyone who's here to participate in that community aspect, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for giving your energy. People who have been leaving supportive comments and emails and things like that, lovely messages that people have been sending us. We really, really, really appreciate it. So thank you all so much. Without the community aspect and the appreciation that we get, what we do would be really quite difficult. So the positive support really keeps us going. So again, e mihi ana kia koutou. Thank you so much. We don't know how long we're going to go for tonight. We don't have some of the limitations that we had on our previous streams. So who knows? We'll see what happens, but we're going to try and keep it a little bit more succinct, but, we never really know what's going to happen, so we'll see. Any other words from you, Samah, before we begin?
No, just thanks everyone for tuning in. It's always humbling to have people actually watching us, little old us. So yeah, thank you, and thank you to our admins.
Yeah.
Looks like someone's waiting for you to give access. But...
Oh, kapai. Well, while you get into Parliamentary Parliament Unpacked, did I get it? I'll say hello to our other admins and make sure that they've got what they need. And Samah, I shall hand it over to you. Modi ora.
Modi ora. All right, so I confess I didn't watch all 3 days of Parliament. I watched 2, Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and then I sort of skimmed the Hansard on Thursday. But I think there was more than enough material on those 2 first days. Our bullies of the week are similar to last week. We've got Winston Peters, Shane Jones, and David Seymour once again coming up on top as the biggest bullies of the week.
Woo!
And again, of course, a lot of racism within that bullying. We posted this part on our socials, and it was Hannah Rafferty Maipi Clark. And it was the first time that she got up to speak on that day. It was on Wednesday. And the first time she gets up to speak, and Winston Peters interjects, and so she's asking a question, and he interjects to say, "Your wording of that question was terrible. I couldn't even understand it," and hilariously mumbled his way into saying that. And then the second time that Hannah stood up to speak, David Seymour interjected, and it was during an extremely serious, important point of her speech as well. She was talking about Takatapui communities and how they're our family, and how the haka was being used in this way against our rainbow communities, and in a way that Hannah was calling out. And David Seymour stands up and interrupts, and he says, actually standing orders say that you can't read a speech from a notepad. And of course, everyone has notes in front of them as they're telling a speech. He was just nitpicking, and the speaker was like, "Oh, she's allowed to have notes in front of her." But yeah, they're just trying to intimidate Hannah, and I think because part of me thinks, oh, maybe we shouldn't spend so much time covering this kind of stuff because it is a little bit of a distraction from the big topics happening in our country. But at the same time, I do think it's important to defend our warriors inside of Parliament. And they do these intimidation tactics, obviously, because they think it works. So I think it's up to us to stand up for them and to keep their morale up as they're doing what they're doing inside the House. So I am going to make it a bit of a job of mine to just call out whenever they harass and bully our favorite politicians.
It's good to look after them.
Definitely. Another person we need to look after is Ricardo Menendez March, who they were also trying to harass and bully in the House. And we posted a little bit of a video of this as well. So in this one, you may have seen it on the news, Winston Peters stood up and he was like, as an immigrant, Ricardo shouldn't be able to use the word Aotearoa for some reason. Very strange thing for him to pipe up with, especially when they themselves, including New Zealand First, use the word Aotearoa in the House. And the speaker, you know, and this is potentially the worst part of it, but the speaker indulged it. He didn't just say, no, you're being ridiculous, sit down. He indulged it and he's saying he's considering it now. And Winston Peters and New Zealand First are doubling down as well. They're saying that they're going to try and get the rules changed so that you can't say Aotearoa without New Zealand. So that's the kind of shit that they waste our Parliament time with. And, you know, these guys always talking about wasting time and wasting money, but seriously, they spend, I'm going to say, you know, I should be charitable, at least a quarter of the time just doing that silly behavior, standing up, interjecting, intimidating, points of order, Mr. Speaker. Oh, I forgot your question, Mr. Speaker. Oh, standing orders. And, you know, they pretend to be all proper and stuff, but it's the most uncivilized shit you'll ever see in your life.
Anything for attention, right? They just, like, I think Jenna Lynch kind of pointed it out recently, right? She was talking about how Luxon has kind of been absent in terms of his media interactions, and that Shane and Winston and New Zealand First and Act have been happy to fill in that void. And because, you know, it's that old saying, you know, any publicity is good publicity. The more that their faces are normalized with us, the more that we passively build up some type of, you know, leniency towards them. So yeah, they're just dancing around for attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's not forget that this is how the media created the Trump phenomenon, right? They just gave him media attention every time he opened his mouth and ended up getting him elected twice. And the media, again, in this case, in New Zealand's case, they don't have to cover every single time David Seymour farts and every single time that Winston Peters does something. Obviously, calling out racism is important, but they definitely give them attention just when they complain about anything. And actually, we're going to see in this next clip, so the news coverage of Winston Peters being racist towards immigrants again, and even in this clip that's meant to be about one of the coalition partners being racist towards immigrants, they somehow managed to twist it to being a pro-David Seymour story. You see the title there, Aotearoa, Winston Peters called out by Seymour after yet another jab at Green MP. Not called out by the Greens, not called out by immigrants, not called out by Ricardo himself, but called out by Seymour. And so, you know, and in that clip, you see that they give a lot of time to David Seymour himself. You got Winston Peters, and then David Seymour responding again. All of that before you get a little bit of Ricardo, who explains why it's problematic. And he gets less time than David Seymour. But let's just play it from there because something else interesting happens in this clip.
Explicitly xenophobic. And again, what we have is language and behavior that can translate to harm outside of these four walls. And the most disappointing thing about this all is that the Prime Minister is literally too scared to hold Winston Peters to account.
The Greens wrote to the Prime Minister not even a month ago when Winston Peters last brought up the national origins of their MPs and Shane Jones yelled, "Send the Mexicans home." They never heard back.
I mean, we can keep writing these letters, but what you're seeing is the Prime Minister is completely missing in action.
The PM wouldn't stop for questions on it today.
Are you going to pull Winston Peters into line?
Choosing silence over a war with Winston.
Well, Jenna is with us now. Jenna, has there been any update today on the ManUp Marae inquiry?
So, for some reason, they pivoted towards the ManUp Marae story, and actually it's not the ManUp Marae story, it's actually the Stats NZ story, because as it currently stands, the issue is at a government data level, and the police investigation to ManUp Marae hasn't even completed. So it's really a story about the government's ability to protect our data, but they're framing it as an anti-Te Pāti Māori story. And they've flipped the story that's meant to be against the coalition doing something bad to being about the opposition party, the minor opposition party doing something bad. And they spend the last over a minute and a half talking about this. So almost a third of the whole piece is just talking about this completely unrelated thing. I just thought it was hilarious that they would try and spin it into...
Oh, you always got to spin it back to some kind of negative story about Māori or Te Pāti Māori. Always.
We have noticed that this happens often. Like, even if a story ends, then they'll make sure they edit the next story to be an anti-Te Pāti Māori or anti-Greens thing, just to leave that as the lingering thought in your brain. They don't want you with a bad taste in your mouth over the coalition government. So that's all the sort of things that they're saying. But let's look at the things that they're doing as well. On Tuesday in Parliament, Brooke Van Velden, who is our Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety, and just to sidestep here for a second, I think that the term workplace relations is quite funny in itself. It kind of reminds me of how they call the relationship between the Crown and Māori as race relations, when really we're talking about two power structures. Here it's the same thing. We're talking about the employer who's in a position of power and the employee who works for them, who works under them. And by saying workplace relations, I think it sends the idea that somehow these relationships are equal, or that there's equivalence between them. It raises the aspects that there's a power structure there, but maybe I'm being pedantic. Let's hear what Brooke is celebrating in the House this week.
To the Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety, what announcements has she made about restoring balance in employment relations?
Mr Speaker,
The Honourable Brooke Van Velden.
I've announced a plan to reintroduce pay deductions for partial strikes. This will be discussed at Select Committee this week. This government has committed to this change because we need to restore balance to the rights and consequences of collective bargaining. If workers are partially striking by refusing to do their normal work, why should they get paid a normal wage? I'm also restoring balance to personal grievances by removing entitlements to remedies in situations where the employee is found to have contributed to the personal grievance. For too long, employees have been able to claim compensation for hurt and humiliation, even if they were dismissed for serious misconduct. It's no wonder I've heard from so many employers who are concerned the personal grievance system is unbalanced in favour of workers.
Okay, so she's celebrating the fact that A, they're going to be offering employers with the ability to cut the pay of people who do partial strike. So currently, the law does allow an employer to suspend someone who's doing a partial strike. So a partial strike might be, we're not going to do the social media for you, or, you know, working to rule, for example, doing certain parts of your jobs, but not certain other parts of your jobs. Perhaps the less essential aspects, so that you can keep things running while also sending a message to your employer. So already, employers have the right to suspend someone while they do a partial strike and only bring them back at the end. But what they're introducing now is the ability for an employer to force them to continue to work, but with less pay while they do the partial strikes. And the Council of Trade Unions, they did a submission on this. And, oh, you're right. This is just showing you that in the Act, it currently, you are allowed to suspend an employee who's doing any sort of strike, partial or otherwise. So the Council of Trade Unions, let's hear their thoughts on this. They say that strikes, this is in their submission about the bill, strikes are already heavily limited in this country. They say that by adding an already harsh system that allows employers to suspend an employee who engages in lawful industrial action, this government wants to sap workers from being able to exercise meaningful industrial power. They also say that at Section 82AAB of the proposed section, the bill contains a catch-all provision, and this is quite concerning. The provision says that in addition to any action carried out at work that impacts on productivity, a partial strike also means an act of the employees who are a party to a strike in breaking their employment agreement, whether or not the act involves any reduction of the employee's normal duties, normal performance at work, normal output, or normal rate of work. So it includes you doing absolutely every single thing that you were meant to do at work. They go on to say, this provision is broad enough to capture a range of activities that are associated with freedom of expression, including the displaying of signs, the wearing of badges, speaking with the media, or making posts on social media.
Eek.
Yeah, so extremely broad provision that takes this idea of partial strikes and potentially expands it to include all sorts of behaviors that employers don't like, that they're going to start docking your pay for. The other thing Brooke Van Velden talked about was the whole personal grievance changes. So what she's talking about, the personal grievances provision, is the only way currently to challenge a dismissal from your employer, okay? So already this is your only path to challenge an unfair dismissal. Again, let's look to the Council of Trade Unions comment on it. And they say that the changes to the personal grievance provisions will only remove the ability of workers to receive compensation on the grounds of humiliation, loss of dignity, and injured feelings if it can be proved a worker has contributed to the situation in some way. Employers will go on fishing exhibitions, trawling for any tiny errors a worker has made in their job or their applications for justice. It is absurd that under these changes, financial remedies for workers would be reduced by up to 100%. Workers who win their case may end up receiving nothing. So basically, the new proposed law will say that if your employer dismissed you, they caused you humiliation, loss of dignity, or injured your feelings in any way throughout that dismissal, the new law is going to say that if you in some way contributed to that dismissal, then it no longer counts for you and you might not be able to get anything at all. That's basically victim blaming, because if you got an unfair dismissal, it's an unfair dismissal, full stop. If you've done something weeks, months ago, completely unrelated, where it just pissed the employer off, and now they can bring that and say, oh, well, they did do this thing, it's going to override your unfair dismissal. And it's just classic victim blaming behavior, which, by the way, the ACT Party did when people came out talking about the mass sexual harassment and abuse within Young ACT. They blamed those young people. They said, oh, if they're telling the truth, why did they go to the media? So they obviously, I feel like it's just continuing with that culture of victim blaming and just trotting on people while they're down. Anyway, Brooke Van Velden, she would know all this if she actually sat down with the trade unions, but she's had an unprecedented lack of engagement with the Council of Trade Unions and with our proper unions in general. Instead, she's been meeting with fake unions, like the Taxpayers Union, and other lobby groups that actually lobby on behalf of employers. So she's not interested at all in what workers have to say. And just to that note, that other things that she's done other than these proposed laws, Brooke Van Velden has also axed fair pay agreements. She extended the availability of 90-day trials to all businesses and promised to overhaul health and safety regulations. And by the way, New Zealand has double the death rate of injuries at work to Australia. So we already have dire statistics. Yeah, double.
Yeah, and they got like the coal industry and stuff like this. Is this like all sectors put in there?
All sectors. We have a extremely high fatal injury rate at work in New Zealand for some reason.
Farms.
It's probably to do a lot with agriculture.
Cows fighting back from having their babies stolen.
Probably. So, we're needing more safety regulations, but she thinks that it's been unbalanced in favor of workers who are the ones dying. Anyway, all of this is extremely unsurprising because who put her in government? Well, this article tells us it was the richest family in this country. Gretchen Hawkesby, who's the daughter of Graham Hart, the richest man in this country, a billionaire, she hosted a house meeting for 70 friends and ACT Deputy Leader Brooke Van Velden. And, you know, you look at the title of this article, it says, want to know who's going to win the election? Watch this seat. So, you know, Andrea Vance, she knows that if a billionaire family puts their sights on someone, they can make them into a politician. And that's, you know, that shouldn't be taken lightly. It shouldn't be glossed over like she's just accepting it as a normal fact of life. That is extreme corruption. And of course, the richest family in this country does not have the interests of workers at heart. It should go without saying. Obviously, also the proof is in the pudding. Everything that she's done so far has been anti-workers. But, you know, you just think about it. These people, millionaires and billionaires, the ones who fund ACT National New Zealand First, they're the employers, right? They're the ones who have the factories, who have to enforce the safety regulations. They're the ones who have to deal with the partial strikes. And so, of course, it makes sense from their end to put someone in there that's going to destroy workers' rights so they can make greater profit. And, you know, this mentality of being pro-millionaire, pro-billionaire is across the whole coalition government, not just her ACT, not just her party ACT, but also National and also New Zealand First. And that's why we saw in the House this week as well, National Chris Luxon defending the millionaires and billionaires.
Well, I'm just saying that we are not going to make the great leap backwards to socialism. For sure.
He pātai tāpiri, why, after years of increases in economic growth, do the top 10% in this country hold almost 60% of the wealth?
Look, I mean, in that question, what you see is not celebrating people who have been successful. You know, that is good. We want more ambition in this country. We want more aspiration. We want people to be successful. We want to celebrate that. That is a good thing. We have a fair tax system, as has been said before. But I'm telling you, what's interesting is what's the one policy idea we've had from the opposition?
He always does this. He always goes to talking about the opposition. Anyway, so Chloe's brought up a really great point here. What's the point of growing our wealth when it's just going to divide according to the current existing inequality lines in this country? And, you know, let's look at our handy little inequality graphs that I believe I'm going to be bringing up often throughout these lives. So we've got in New Zealand, and these are updated graphs. They were a little bit different last time because I was using different data sets. But and these ones are the most charitable ones to our wealthy people. So we've got the richest half of the population, so 50% of the population, and they have 93% of the wealth in the country. So the other half of us, that includes us, we are over here scrapping over that 6.7% of the wealth. We're over here blaming each other, fighting with each other, having all these culture wars, and just barely struggling to survive and feed our kids because we're fighting over that 6.7% of the wealth. And then on this other graph, you've got the richest 5% of the country with almost 40% of the wealth. That's just a handful of people with over a third of the wealth of the country to themselves. So the issue of inequality means that even if this country grows its wealth, it's just going to divide according to these statistics anyway. And that's the point that Chloe was making. And then they just went to their go-to, oh, you're just being envious. You should celebrate success. Like, no, I don't celebrate one person having more than hundreds and thousands of people put together. Like, no, I don't buy into the fact that a millionaire or a billionaire like Graham Hart does more work than hundreds of thousands of people put together. I don't believe that these millionaires and billionaires are just bigger geniuses, more hardworking geniuses, because I know from my own personal life, the hardest working people that I know, like my own parents, like our own families, they're not rich. And I'm willing to wager that they are a lot smarter than some of these billionaires and millionaires. So, no, we don't have to buy into this idea that, you know, we need to be happy for people to just be hoarding all the wealth in this country. And where does that idea end anyway? Like, he's saying we need to celebrate it. Okay, but what if 10% owned 90% of the wealth? Will we still celebrate it? What if they owned 99% of the wealth? What if 90% of the population had to live on 1% of the wealth? Would that be okay? You know, so there's no, and they have been asked that before. They've been like, you know, what do you think is a limit? And they refuse to give it because they don't want to even indulge in that way of thinking. They just want us to accept that a few families are just going to hoard all the wealth that's, by the way, mined out of our collective resources, the land that belongs to Māori first and foremost, but the resources that all of us rely on to survive. A few people making their wealth out of that, and they want us to grow. And again, we know that New Zealand is the 7th richest country in the world. Here it is from yet another website. So 7th richest country in the world. We don't need to grow our wealth. And if we do, it's just going to divide according to current inequality lines. So that's my kōrero about Parliament Unpacked. And just to end it by saying that it's clear where the corruption is coming from, right? It's blatantly obvious and clear. You've got the richest family in the country putting someone that they want into workplace relations, for goodness sake. It's the most obvious and blatant corruption that you can see. And yet, who does our media focus on? Te Pāti Māori. The one part, you know, the party that made by far the lowest donations. I think they only had one big donor, John Tamahiri.
Shot John.
And even that, it was like 100 and something thousand. And Auckland got, and ACT got millions and millions in funding. So they actually punched down on the grassroots people-powered parties like Te Pāti Māori and like the Greens in order to divert us away from the real power, which is what we've just seen, the richest people in this country. I mean, they're doing it in the open. They're funding them in the open. It would be very easy for journalists to just hyper-focus on that and talk about all the rich people that are funding our politicians. You can find all that information online, but they don't want to. And so what do they got to do? They've got to manufacture different corruption for us to focus on. And that's why we're going to see these attacks on Greens and Te Pāti Māori just explode as we come up to the election. I know it's already been bad, but I believe it's only going to get worse. They're going to go non-stop all the way up until the election because it's all they got. It's all they got. All they have to fill the gap of, hold on a second, how come we're the 7th richest country in the world and yet we're all still struggling? And how come we got slop for our kids? And how come we can't afford good hospitals? How come we're the 7th richest country in the world and we don't have basic public services? Well, they can't answer that question, so they're just going to bash Te Pāti Māori.
Or Labour. Blame it all on the last term.
Oh, yeah, for sure. In terms of national, that's all they've got. And I just wanted to show you just a few seconds of one especially deranged anti-Te Pāti Māori rant that Duncan Garner made on renowned racist pro-Israel channel, The Platform. Let's hear what he has to say.
But the Māori Party's odd now. They are oddly angry. It's like they want revenge on the Pākehā system. They'll stop at nothing, I reckon, to tip this country up. They're angry. Chris Hipkins from Labour will suffer getting too close to these guys. He should call them out, but he's got no balls either. We've had 50...
Okay, so they're going to... Te Pāti Māori is going to tip the country over.
Oh, my God.
Not these billionaires that are trying to extract every last bit of life from our country and kill even more of our workers. No. Te Pāti Māori, the people-powered party, is going to tip our country over. Then he goes on to call Tākuta Ferris the most arrogant person in Parliament while congratulating Shane Jones. I mean, you just couldn't even write this level of irony if you wanted. So, and click on the next link because you can see his videos there. It's not just one. He's going on one after another after another election scandal, exposing the bias of media. That one, the bias of the media one. He's talking about how the media is biased towards Te Pāti Māori. This is a really common tactic. You see it from David Seymour, the Axe Party, often. Basically, the right-wingers pretending that mainstream media is left-wing. We all know that mainstream media protects power. We see them attacking Te Pāti Māori day after day after day while just letting David Seymour, enabling mass sexual abuse and harassment in Young Act, enabling a pedophile to remain as party president and sending the victims to a lawyer that is actually part owned by his godmother. The media ignores all of that and talks about a police investigation that Te Pāti Māori has invited themselves and just anything they can get on them, right? You guys remember how they covered Golriz. But the right-wing media acts like the media is too left-wing in order to push them even more to the right. That's the game that they play. And Duncan Garner's playing it. And I mean, I knew he was a hack as soon as he went on the platform, right? So.
It's so sad to see Duncan Garner do this. I mean, I used to have a little bit of a soft spot for Duncan because he used to talk about some issues that crossed over for me in terms of what I was interested in, but it's sad to see him go down the same path as New Zealand First, as the ACT Party. He can see that their popularity is picking up, you know, the anti-Māori sentiment that they push out. You know, we know that they do it to get a reaction. There are other things as well, but it gets a reaction. And if you look at Duncan's videos here, you know, where he is deciding to target Māori, they've got the most views. You look at all of these, and all of the ones where he's talking negatively about Māori have the most views. You scroll down a little bit, and we're only about, these are 3 weeks ago, and the views, this one's on 200 views. 2,000, 1,000, 2,000. But then you look at the latest tirade against Te Iwi Māori, 10,000, 7,000, not too bad, 19,000, 50,000. So, you know, money talks, views
Racist
talk
for hire
for these types of people. So I'm sad because we're going to see him go further down that track because the only attention that he's now getting, it seems, is from the racists. So he's going to double down, triple down, quadruple down. Wouldn't be surprised if we see him join up with Hobson's Pledge or those other groups in the near future. It's a shame.
So that's the demise of Duncan Garner. Even though they tried to rehabilitate his image on Celebrity Treasure Island and just make him look like a lovable, colorblind teddy bear, he's actually happy to play the games of white supremacists when it gets him what he wants. Bye-bye, that's my Parliament Unpacked. I hope you enjoyed my segment, fam.
Very good. Oh, that was amazing. That was amazing. Isn't she amazing? Isn't she amazing, E Hoa?
Oh, shut up.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to talking about Rarotonga. You know, even just look at this picture. Just look at this picture they got here. They've got, of course, the Chinese flag front and center. Because that's the whole thing, right? Scary China is starting to stretch out its little octopus tentacles everywhere. Let's listen to what TV1 News presenter Simon says. He gives away part of the narrative here.
We begin tonight with exclusive details of a deal that could shatter New Zealand's close relationship with a Pacific neighbour. The Cook Islands is set to strike a major partnership agreement with China, causing deep concern. The move would be a big win for Beijing, which is trying to exert...
Still got that Chinese flag in there, you know, it's taking over all the islands. And so the main thing that I picked up there, saying that the islands are getting too close to China and that this is some type of concern for not just us here, but for the people of the Cook Islands, of Rarotonga. Now, if we take things back a little bit, the Cook Islands have been on their sovereignty journey, their independence journey for a while now. Before the China deal took place, the Cook Islands were trying to get their own passport. And the New Zealand government said, well, if you're going to do that, we're going to null and void the current New Zealand passports that you use. People in the Cook Islands, they have a New Zealand passport, for those who don't know. No compromises, nothing about, oh, maybe we can work on a dual citizenship or anything like that. No compromising, just a flat out no. If you do that, we're going to take away your New Zealand passport. And it goes back to when Helen Clark was in. She declined the Cook Islands becoming a
full member of the United Nations.
A full member of the United Nations. And so, they're a realm nation, I think. They're very highly tied into Aotearoa. And
they used to be an official colony of Aotearoa before they entered into this agreement, which New Zealand wanted to stop the Cook Islands from being fully independent. So it still ties them to us.
Kia ora, thank you. So this has been going on for a while now. Here's another article. Luxon was asked if he would consider cutting funding to the Cook Islands, which he said he would consider. He's waiting to see what is in the China deal. But that's the kind of light, vague threats that have been thrown out. The Cook Islands, this is really something that they want. They're pursuing things that they want. And Luxon is talking about potentially cutting funding. So, these kinds of little threats that we're seeing coming out. Oh, and of course, we mentioned this last week, but of course, the Matthew Hooton article, which it's just outrageous, really. You're going to have to use a paywall bypass if you want to see that one. He throws out the idea of invading the Cook Islands. Invading the Cook Islands. If you were an individual and you lived in Rarotonga and you started seeing headlines of New Zealand media talking about invading your country, you'd be very concerned. At least I would find that very intimidating, very scary.
And just to put that into context, the Cook Islands is a tiny nation with a 15,000 people population. And they used to be a colony of New Zealand. So we already had that colonized relationship with them. And now for some of our media to be vaguely suggesting that we invade the Cook Islands, you can see how serious that is given the power imbalance.
And some people are asking, why would Cook Islands want to sign up with China? We covered it in the last week. There are shortcomings of the New Zealand government. Things like cleaning up the sunk Manawanui off the coast of Samoa. We haven't done that, and so now Samoa is reaching out to China. There are various infrastructure programs that the Cook Islands want to develop. All sorts of things, going for their own citizenship. Potentially, if they build up their own capacity, they're going to be able to do that. And New Zealand doesn't seem like they want to help them on that journey. So all of these vague threats, potentially going to invade them, potentially going to have funding cut. There's another article here where someone is theorizing what removing the New Zealand passports would look like. Is it going to result in Donald Trump style deportations of Cook Islanders? So again, very, very scary. Now let's move to how the media has been framing things again. Yes, there was a protest in Rarotonga. Te Pāti Māori's Debbie Ngarewa-Packer was there, which I thought was interesting. It turns out she was there just as a coincidence to celebrate her 30th anniversary with her husband. But let's have a quick little listen to this clip here.
Asking for you, as Prime Minister of this country, step down and be the I put them on notice today. One, he has to resign as Prime Minister of this country. So I asked him that, or otherwise, before that, I asked him to actually apologize on behalf of the people of the Cook Islands, to the people of the Cook Islands, more so to the people of the government of New Zealand.
It's not like home, like it's
actually
not. We got the wrong part of the clip. I was thinking, Aroha mai e te iwi. So that was Te Ariki Heather. He's one of the members of the opposition party, and obviously he is very opposed to what Mark Brown has been doing. But I think where we want to be on this clip is just after Debbie's little interview there.
Okay. Got the wrong timestamps.
There we go. We get there.
The Prime Minister here hadn't seen or heard what was in the agreement with China before it was released late this afternoon.
We expect to see it shortly. We'll take our time to digest it, and then we'll obviously have conversations with the cooks themselves.
The Cook Islands government says the 5-year action plan negotiated
Aroha mai. It's this part of the interview.
I was right.
There was this assumption that I had arrived for that.
the protest organised by the leader of the country's
No. We've already seen this part. I think we'll move on because sometimes we arrange these clips and we get them a bit mixed up. This is actually the clip that we were wanting to show. So the media is framing it that Rarotonga is concerned because of China, because of this growing influence from China. But more so, the point has really been that people in the Cook Islands are afraid of New Zealand's response to what has happened. There has been condemnation of Mark Brown in his decision, but from everything that we've seen, from various interviews with Te Atatū and other people, other parties, other groups, even newspapers from the Cook Islands, is that the concern isn't so much with the deal with China, it's the retaliation, the response that we've seen from our politicians and our media. So I'll play this clip. You just listen to the first 30 seconds or so, and he gives his reasoning around why the protest in Rarotonga took place.
We're protesting or otherwise showing our concerns and issues relating to the Prime Minister's decision to bring up the passports and also our relationship with New Zealand. So the march is basically that we, the people of the Cook Islands, totally disagree what the Prime Minister has done and is still doing, and New Zealand now is furious about our relationship. So that's why the march is on Monday.
You know what, you want to say something? But I would just say, we don't hear anything in terms of the concerns that they have around the increase of China's influence in the area. It's all about the retaliation from our politicians.
I was going to say that what that previous clip showed at one part of it, and also another clip that we had from One News, is that both of them were saying that this protest was because of the deal with China. That Cook Islanders were protesting the deal with China. And our news said this numerous times, but we watched numerous interviews with the people organizing, and they didn't bring up the China deal as being a main cause of the protest. They barely brought up China at all in the conversations. So they're actually worried about New Zealand being furious.
Exactly. And as well, perhaps a minor point, but this opposition leader, Te Atatū, he was anticipating about 1,000 people for their protest, but it looked like numbers on the day. There was some count from another article which put the numbers at about 400. So perhaps not the support that the opposition party thinks they have against what Mark Brown is doing. But it all remains to be seen. I think the main point from us is that the media is really framing it in that anti-China perspective, but that's not what we're hearing on the ground. Some other things that we're hearing, China or people have been accusing New Zealand of being bullies. And we find it in multiple articles. I have to admit, though, in some of the multiple articles, it's coming from the same person. So it's not that everyone is supportive or everyone is against. There is a mixed bag, but it's in terms of how our media is reporting on what's going on that I take issue with. All right. Where are we moving next?
So Cook Islanders are protesting because they're scared because New Zealand, in Mark Brown's words, reared its teeth and threatened them. And, to the point where, look what Mark Brown says. He told One News Pacific correspondent Barbara Drever that he didn't want to talk, quote, in case you do another hatchet job on me. So, Mark Brown has this perception, and, I don't know anything about him, but he's right about the fact that the news did do a hatchet job on him. They pretty much generated this whole angst around the China Cook Islands deal. and resulted in this protest of Cook Islanders basically being like, please don't take our passports away.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that even in the clips of the news that they were covering it. The images of the protest are all of them holding New Zealand's passports right at the front and, saying don't take our passports, all the speakers. So that's clearly what the protest is about. It's because we threatened the Cook Islands.
Kapai. So other things that are going on?
So what is the real reason then that New Zealand is putting out this anti-China and Cook Islands narrative? Like we talked in the last episode, this isn't new. He mentioned just before that we stopped the Cook Islands from being a member state of the United Nations. We did the same thing to Niue, who also used to be one of our colonies that we now have a relationship with. So this is our position as a colonizer of the islands goes back a long time. But what's happening right now is our relationship with the United States is dictating to us that we start behaving towards the islands in a certain way. The reason that this is happening is because of the United States wishes to expand their empire. It's as simple as that. And they want to expand into the Pacific. And they also have a long-standing history of colonization in the Pacific. In the 1800s, they occupied 3 Pacific islands, including Hawaii, and they used these islands as nuclear test sites. They did horrific things in those places. And then in the 1850s, they got into stronger relationships with New Zealand and Aotearoa because of the ANZUS relationship. And ever since then, New Zealand has stopped aligning itself with British foreign policy and started aligning itself with US foreign policy. And this has only grown in recent years to the point where today the United States has around 400 bases in the Pacific. So their relationship with the Pacific is to militarize the hell out of it. And even recently they added a base to Australia without discussing it with the public. They just do what they like. And look at all of those dots. Those are all US bases all around the world. And in our backyard in the Pacific, as you can see, they want to have dominance over the Pacific Oceans. And now you might be wondering, how many bases does China have in the Pacific or in the world? And when you compare, that's China's military bases. That's it. And as you can see, the Pacific, which is their backyard, has none. And you compare that again back to the US, and look at how they're surrounding China with military bases. Absolutely surrounding them. I mean, the United States would never in a million years allow any country to put all of these military bases around them where they can reach them. Mm-hmm. And now on top of that, they're saying we don't even want China to do business in the Pacific. We just want it completely for ourselves. We want to use it to antagonize you, to surround you, whatever. And they've been angling for a war with China for a long time. So they're trying to have all these strategic positions so that when or if that happens, they have dominance materially, materialistically.
Yeah, all you China haters in the comments. What do you think about that? I mean, this is the main thing for me, right? Look at all of these army bases. And that's the colonization style of America, to invade you. The colonization style of China is to build infrastructure for your country and then send you a bill. And that's voluntary. That's done relationally. That's it's a voluntary thing. Now, of course, China has done awful things. They're a huge country. Here in Aotearoa, we have done awful, condemnable things, and we're a tiny country. We're not trying to say that China is, perfect. No country is perfect. But there is that difference between invasion via building infrastructure or invasion via looking like Gaza. There's a huge difference. And, America is the only country in the world that has nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarines all over the world they could literally kill any of us at any given time. And I don't know the exact numbers, but it's in the hundreds in terms of those nuclear-armed, nuclear submarines that the USA has all over the world. And my understanding is China only has like a 100th of that type of capacity themselves. So it's quite clear in terms of who is the dominant one, who is the one sprawling out into everyone's backyard. And it makes sense for China to be reaching out to its Pacific neighbors to start building relationships, to start making friends via opening up trade deals, offering to build infrastructure and things like that, because they can see, and we've all seen it, every year there is some new war crime that the USA is responsible for. Things are shrinking, things are warming up, and so it's a smart move, in my opinion, for China to be reaching out to its specific neighbors, to be building those relationships. Of course, there are concerns, and I am very interested from an environmental perspective to see what is in the China deal with the Cook Islands. But, it's not about picking a side, but it is about how to do what you got to do with the least amount of harm. I'm not going to be putting full judgment on this deal that Mark Brown is doing until we see the specifics of what comes out.
And these military bases, they're not just, sitting there and having fun. Like, this website's really good, actually, because it lets you click on the military bases. And when you do click on it, look, I just clicked on a random one. The US military is poisoning Okinawa. And
this is a great resource. Wow.
It really is. And so a lot of them have that. They're like, so-and-so was done for rape at this military base, or they dumped, in some of the islands I was reading that they dump their pollution, their waste there. So, going back to last week, we talked about Chris Bishop saying poorer countries don't look after their environment. Well, part of it is because the United States empire is dumping their waste on these countries. So that's the kind of relationship that the United States wants with the islands. They want to be able to put military bases in all of our backyards and to threaten China with it. And on the other hand, as you say, China's trying to build up relationships with its neighbors and do business deals that benefit it as well, like any other normal country. So that's why we want to follow that. Well, that's why the United States wants us, New Zealand, to be bullying the island countries in order to stop making friends with China and to depend entirely on us, and then to make deals with the United States and let them have at it. But in New Zealand, Luxon has been fear-mongering that we might have a Ukraine situation in the Indo-Pacific region. So this is what they're saying to try and convince us to be afraid of China taking over the Pacific. They're trying to argue, and I've heard them say it numerous times, that we could have a Ukraine situation in the Pacific through China invading someone like Taiwan, for example. And here's Luxon saying in one of the interviews.
But also that, frankly, with the flashpoints that we have within our region of the Indo-Pacific, that we could have a Ukraine in East Asia, for example, given some of the tensions and flashpoints that we've potentially got. So
that's massive fear-mongering. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that China's going to invade a country in the way that Russia invaded Ukraine. What is interesting about it, though, is that the US did a similar thing with Russia before they, yes, illegally invaded Ukraine, but before that happened, the United States also was surrounding Russia with military bases, trying to antagonize them. And that's what they're trying to get from China. I don't think that China will do it, but that's where that mentality is coming from. And actually, in that interview that we just looked at, the reporter asks Luxon, what did you learn at this NATO summit? And Luxon says, well, one of the things I learned at the NATO summit is that we might have a Ukraine in the Indo-Pacific. Now, where did Luxon get this idea from? There's this report by a United States think tank. It's called the U.S. Institute of Peace. It's, it's very Orwellian.
Sounds like
right?
a taxpayers unit AstroTurfy kind of name.
Exactly. I mean, they are the Institute of War, let's be real, but it's a very influential think tank in the United States. And basically, they try to come up with reasons for why war is the reason that you get peace. And in this paper, they discuss quite frankly and in depth why what happened in Ukraine has helped them convince New Zealanders to become closer to NATO. And they discuss in depth, New Zealanders, they didn't really have much affinity to NATO. They didn't really know much about it, care for it, or trust it. But after the Ukraine thing happened, and they describe how Jacinda Ardern went above and beyond, that for the first time in New Zealand's history, they put unilateral sanctions on Russia. What does unilateral mean? It means it was before the United Nations made an official legal rule to sanction Russia, which they did eventually. Jacinda was like, I'll do whatever you want, United States. I'll sanction Russia immediately, unilaterally. And they did. And they looked at that and they were like, whoa, New Zealand is willing to bend over backwards for us. And they were like, and they managed to convince the public somehow, because we were really against the Russian war as a population. And so we backed our governments backing Ukraine. And they were like, let's use that pro-NATO energy. And you see it, they say it in the article. NATO and its Indo-Pacific partners should explore, at least privately, the relevance of successful cooperation between Indo-Pacific and European countries on Ukraine as a potential model for coordination on a contingency in the Indo-Pacific. So that's where Luxon got this idea from, because NATO has been studying it for quite some time, and they're telling him, put this narrative out. We might have a Ukraine in the Indo-Pacific, and they'll just buy into your pro-NATO narratives. And of course, Labour agrees with Luxon that New Zealand should be open to deploying peacekeepers to Ukraine. Like I said, Labour had already set the groundwork for being extremely aligned with the United States with their stance on Ukraine. And so Luxon's just continuing that. Labour continues with that. We over here, of course, are vehemently anti-sending troops anywhere for any reason. They said they sent peacekeepers to Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, as you can see in Nikki Haga's books, he found that actually they committed a lot of crimes against our people while they were there. So we cannot trust that they're going to be peacekeepers. And we should just be working towards a mission of demilitarizing the Pacific. And that is a dream that many people in the Pacific have. A lot of people in the Pacific love their environment. They want to protect their homelands. And this is going in the complete opposite direction, wanting to support the US in their war plans in the Pacific, wanting to send peacekeepers to Ukraine. And of course, they want to increase defense budget funding. All of these things sending us in this direction is playing off that energy that, well, New Zealand's already supported Ukraine, so they want to continue with that and build our relationship with NATO even closer. And right, I was just going to say here that we are very, very, very heavily aligned with NATO already. So this is just continuing in that trajectory. We are already part of the Five Eyes, so we provide, spy information for the United States to support them in their wars. And actually, we just saw recently that Rocket Lab has said that they're willing and ready to serve the Pentagon. And, they're using New Zealand's soil as it is to put out rockets that spy and support the United States in their war aims. We're part of the IP4, which is a NATO-aligned grouping. It's basically like a mini Pacific NATO, and it's got New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan. And it's us countries in the Pacific planning against China, basically, along with NATO. They've brought us in on these plans in all these different ways. And just to say that Labour started actually our very close relationship with NATO in 2001, when New Zealand started to be engaged in dialogue and cooperation with NATO, and they started having regular meetings and contact. I tweeted this at Helen Clark, and she blocked me after that.
Blocked by Helen Clark. Oh, that's an achievement.
Because Helen Clark keeps coming out and saying, "Oh no, don't join AUKUS, don't join this. Don't get close to NATO, stay independent." It's like, what are you talking about? You brought us closer to NATO than we ever were, and sent troops to Afghanistan. That's what started all of this. Actually, Helen Clark sending troops to Afghanistan, and under the guise of fighting terror, when of course they were bringing terror to our lands. That was the argument that the government of the time used to bring New Zealand into the folds of NATO. And so, it's the usual practice, right? Use any crisis. Then it was 9/11 to justify coming close to NATO. Now it's the crisis in Ukraine that New Zealand used to become closer to NATO. And because there's not a real crisis in the Pacific, they're just going to manufacture that one and pretend we're going to have a Ukraine in the Pacific to get the New Zealand public to buy into sending troops. Another thing is that ACT wants to, well, not ACT actually, the New Zealand government. We should always just keep in mind that ACT only does things that the New Zealand government in general wants to do, the vast majority of time anyway. They just give them unpopular policies, I believe, so they can be the front men for it. But yeah, so they want to increase defense spending to 2%. Funnily enough, just a year and a bit earlier, they said they wanted to increase defense funding by 1.5%. To 1.5% of GDP, and now they're saying they want it to be to 2% of GDP. But yeah, they just, it's gone up by 5% in that time for some reason. And the funny thing is that in Parliament as well, just this week, I did
0.5%. I'll just say
0.5. The David Seymour in the House this week, he said in one of his smarmy interruption question things that basically his government is not into spending for the sake of spending, and that if they cut spending, it's actually a good thing because they're going to put less money but in a more targeted place. And yet he's doing the exact opposite when it comes to the military. He's suggesting they spend 2% of GDP just for the sake of spending 2% of GDP, instead of saying, hey, we need this and this and this, and that's why we should spend. But anyway, so we can't afford hospitals or public services or healthy food for our children, but they want to spend 2% of our GDP on military. I'm not calling it defense. It's military. So yeah, I mean, it's classic, but I think we do need to be really aware of our closeness with NATO and the United States war aims. I think we need to push back really hard against increased military spending, against sending troops to Ukraine, against antagonizing our Pacific Islands. And yeah, we need to work on our indigenous solidarity movements in the islands and across the world, and resist American imperialism. Because yeah, when you look at the map with all the bases, I mean, it's a little bit scary, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. And everything that the USA is doing at the moment, I can't think of a country that I would like to get further away from, to be honest.
Yeah. So we don't want New Zealand to get closer to the United States. And, talking about shared values, that as well should be terrifying, because, the United States is waging genocide, apartheid, the most horrific destruction of life and environment that you could possibly imagine. And they're saying we share values with these people. And it's true. They across the board, our government supports colonizers. They support Israel. They support the United States. They're against indigenous people in Aotearoa, in Palestine, in Rarotonga, in Niue, in Samoa. And they support the project of US imperialism.
Kapai. Well, shall we, without a segue onto our next topic?
Our main topic.
Main topic for tonight. I've been wanting to talk about Destiny's Church for a long time, and now they've finally given us a golden opportunity. So everyone should be aware that Destiny's Church and their ManUp group, ManUp essentially is Destiny's Church. It's just one of their many arms. On Saturday, they stormed, that was a word that Brian used, right? Stormed the Te Atatū library. There was a pride event taking place. And, this pride event, from my perspective, it's about encouraging acceptance. And it's about, learning about gender fluidity and learning about gender in general, which I think is a great thing to do. And it's a conversation that a lot of people are having. And so, this ticketed event was, parents participated there with their children. You can imagine a lot of children coming home and repeating kinds of narratives that we hear about our Takatapui community, parroting some of the misinformation and discrimination that our rainbow community, our Takatapui community faces, and parents wanting to do something about their children who might have those seeds of bigotry that have been planted in them by our very society. And so I think it's a good idea, a ticketed event where children can be introduced to some colorful characters. Anyway, the ManUp group decided to storm the event, and I would show the footage of the storming and the violence that took place, but Auckland Pride put out a message saying that they didn't want people sharing the footage, which, is respectable. But it was very, very violent. I think it's important that it is seen. People punching people, people pushing people, shoving people, pushing them over on stairways, stepping over people on stairways. Not only is that an incredibly disrespectful thing to do, but when there is that argy-bargy, lots of people pushing on stairways is an incredibly dangerous thing to do. And of course, for the families that were there and the children that were there, it would have been an incredibly terrifying situation for all of them. So some of the things that have been happening, a lot of people have been saying, let's register Destiny's Church as a gang, so that they can go under the gang patch legislation. Even Hone Harawira has decided to speak up, encouraging that Destiny's Church, or at least ManUp, be registered under that legislation. But from our perspective, what have we seen in terms of people being punished under the gang patch legislation? It's been individuals. It's been people who are wearing what potentially looks like gang insignia. It's been individuals. And that I believe is the wrong approach for us in this instant. Members of Destiny's Church, members of ManUp, Destiny's Church targets vulnerable people. They target people who fall through the cracks, just like all of our gang whānau. The gangs are there because people fall through the cracks, and then someone decides to take up the mantle to shepherd those individuals. So we're talking about vulnerable communities here, and if we're talking about adding them to the gang patch legislation, we're going to see those individuals punished rather than the leadership of Destiny's Church. And so instead of campaigning for that, we've been encouraging people instead to push for the charity status of Destiny's Church and all of their various groups to be removed. Now, Labour's Phil Twyford has called for their charity status to be taken away, and I think that's a great thing. I don't agree with everything Phil Twyford says, but credit where credit is due. And now, as a response to what has happened, Papa, Peoples Against Prisons Aotearoa, which is an awesome prison abolition group, they are organizing a rally for this Sunday at Albert Park. You see, they've got this incredible poster here, Day of Queer Power, these queers bash back. I love it. They've been pulled up on that wording, bash back, but I mean, it's got bash back. You know what I mean? It's talking about self-defense. And I think it's a strong, good message that does need to be put out there. There's going to be various speakers who are there. It's looking like it's going to be a nice event. They are anticipating that Destiny's Church may be present. That's been a clear message through their promotions. And so I'm sure they've put things in place to ensure the safety of all of their participants, but they are encouraging people to travel in pairs, make sure that you're vigilant, things like that. Do be aware that there could be potentially a counter protest on the day. So just be mindful of that. The event has 2 demands. One of the demands, that the government dismantles Destiny Church organizationally and deregisters all of Destiny's charities, which I think is fantastic. And the second demand, for all government agencies to stop referring people to Destiny front groups like ManUp, which I think is, that's essential right there. So really do encourage people to get to the event on Sunday. We'll be putting updates about it on our socials. So if you're looking for information, either go to Papa or we will try to get information out to people ourselves. So obviously it would have been an incredibly terrifying event for people. This meme created by Chad Left is a great account to follow, Chad Left on Instagram. What have our politicians been saying? I haven't heard any condemnation from the ACT Party. In, I think it was 2018, David calls Brian Tamaki a good man. This apparently tough on crime party has, from what I've seen, said nothing about what has happened, but he decided to take issue with the wording on this poster, the bash back wording on that poster. That's the only comment that I've seen from David Seymour in terms of the event, which I think is shameful. And another thing that I wanted to say is, it's mostly kids. It's mostly kids. When you see the way that the media has been framing it, they didn't highlight any of the violence, and I think maybe that's because Auckland Pride asked them not to. But instead, what we saw was kids doing haka. No doubt these children have just been brought along by their parents. I would love to speak to them and see who knows what's going on. And I can see the passion that these rangatahi have. It's a very painful thing to see our taonga, our haka, being used to spread these hateful messages, seeing our tamariki, our rangatahi being used in this way, which is something Hannah said in Parliament, which was great. So what is Destiny's Church? Who is Destiny's Church? It's led by Brian Tamaki. Okay, he's everyone should know Brian Tamaki by now. He's been around for quite a long time. Who is Brian Tamaki? What he reminds me of Winston Peters. If you look at the old articles about Brian Tamaki and Winston Peters, they're always described as this charismatic type of leader. Has this very, and I want to be careful with my words because I'm aware that so many people do follow Brian Tamaki and supports Brian Tamaki. But, it has all of the hallmarks of a cult. This charismatic idol that's at the center, who's idolized by Destiny's Church. It's really disturbing, and I'll just play a little bit of this clip if I can find the timestamp. And it just gives a bit of a sense of the type of group, the type of individual that Brian Tamaki is, and kind of energy that he has, and the type of group. We'll play it here. If I can find the exact timestamp. Samah, fill some time for me, please.
I just wanted to add, the media, they really, really did focus on the haka. All the coverage that I saw about the Destiny Church attacks, the worst parts were on the stairs, and they did show that clip on the stairs, so it wasn't out of respect for Pride, but they showed the clip on the stairs a little bit in between just massive chunks of them doing haka. And I believe that, and that this is part of Destiny Church's intention as well, the way that these groups are being used, is actually to make haka look bad, to make Māori look bad, and to make protest movements look bad. For the news to even, the fact of them calling it protest and then showing the haka consistently, the idea of protest and haka is what you get in your brain, except they're homophobic and they're, attacking and in a fascistic way our rainbow communities. And I think the impact on that is it does send messages to the viewer that puts a negative association with haka and with Māori protest movements. And I think it was wrong of the media to focus so much on that, knowing that the haka was being misused in that way.
Definitely. Okay, I can't find the timestamp, so I'll just talk through it. But basically, he compares Jacinda and Chris Hipkins to Nazis. It's when he's criticizing, COVID restrictions. So he speaks to that crowd a lot. Not only that, but in this clip, he talks a lot about masculinity and how it wasn't violence that people saw, and it wasn't violence that people were upset with. They were upset because for the first time they're seeing real masculinity. And it's an interesting thing about the ManUp program. The ManUp program is meant to be about opening up. The ManUp program is meant to be about opening up. And for me, it's the toxic masculinity in our society, which, demands to our tāne how they're meant to behave. It's that toxic masculinity that creates that barrier which stops us from being able to open up. And it's strange. I feel like ManUp was created in response to more of us talking about the patriarchy, more of us talking about or trying to uplift our wahine, and there was some energy in the air, some kind of man-hating, man-shaming kind of energy. And ManUp was, from my opinion, because ManUp kind of came about during like the Jordan Peterson time when he was criticizing gender. ManUp came probably like within a year of that whole kaupapa. And so, he's criticizing seeing femininity in people. That's what he's criticizing. He think, because from his perspective, he's a Christian fundamentalist. He sees homosexuality and same-sex relations as a sin. And really all same-sex relations and homosexuality and all that is just gender fluidity. It's breaking down those toxic things like the toxic aspects of masculinity. And for him to see people, gender fluid people, being so comfortable in their fluidity, it drives him crazy because of his Christian fundamentalism. Now, he's not all of a sudden being like this. He's been doing this for a long time. 20 years ago, he took this rōpū here, and they protested against the Civil Union Bill 20 years ago. So same tactics, he's got his kaihaka out the front. And of course, you look at the crowd, and the majority of people that you will see are children, because these are families. And that's the interesting thing about Destiny's Church. They don't really have so many like one-off supporters and whatnot. They have whole families. And that's what makes a lot of this really quite difficult. There are real families that find a lot of comfort in the things that Brian Tamaki is doing and talking about. He is providing community for families. And so in terms of how we respond to these situations and the ways that we talk about these situations, it's really a whole new, different beast. I remember when we went to the Posey Parker counter-protest, it was very confronting then coming face to face with members of Destiny's Church and ManUp, because it's all just families. It's all just young families. And, it was quite a confrontational, quite a scary situation, both groups kind of yelling at each other. But I think that dynamic, that yelling at each other, inability to hear each other and listen to each other is just going to drive these types of individuals even further into that way of thinking. So it's a tricky situation, the Destiny's Church situation. Not only are they protesting against gender fluidity, civil unions and things like that. Last year, one of their youth leaders of their Boys to Men group was done for sexual assault. I think he has about 22 charges against him, preying on vulnerable members of their youth program, preying on people that they're meant to be looking after. And so, of course, there's all of this controversy around Destiny's Church. We don't have enough time to go into all of it. Recently, painting over the rainbow crossings. Yeah, it's not nice. And I'll just talk a little bit about Brian's style of preaching. His style of preaching has been described as what's called as prosperity gospel or prosperity theology. There were two advisors to Pope Francis who critiqued prosperity theology or prosperity gospel, and essentially what it's about, it reflects the Destiny's Church model very well. The more wealth you have, the better off you are, the healthier you are. That reflects God's goodwill. So the more rich you are, the more affluent, the more of an idol you are, the more of a sign that you have God's will and God's good graces. And also there is the inverse of that. If you're in poverty, if you are sick, if you are unwell, then that is seen as a sign that essentially God hates you. And because Destiny's Church, fundamental Christianity, they have their things against homosexuality. And I know that not all Christians are like this. You know, Destiny's Church are a very, you know, the things coming from Destiny's Church is like the far, far, far kind of fundamental Christian values. Our own Westboro Baptist Church was like super crazy, racist, homophobic church group, like crazy radicals in America. And interestingly, prosperity gospel, these two advisors to Pope Francis, they trace prosperity gospel back to America and back to this idea of the American dream. And they tie America's success as a country as being a reflection of their faith. And basically the main criticism of prosperity gospel from these two advisors is that it takes away the true meaning of Christianity, of having faith, and moves it more towards materialism. Another thing that the prosperity gospel teaches is that the more you donate to charitable purposes, like say your church leader, the stronger the connection between you and God will be. Now, Destiny's Church members, I learned from this article, it's from about 10 years ago, Destiny's Church members donate 10% of their income to the church. 10% of their income. And a lot of ex-members have criticized that, and they say that Destiny's Church is just a money-grabbing type of scheme. Because of course, Brian really does live a very luxurious life. But of course, from his style of preaching, that's a sign that he is really loved by God. And so his followers will see him living his luxurious life, and they won't view him as living outside of his means while they are suffering. They will see him as, the idol, the epitome of what God wants to see. And they aspire to be that.
And if they're poor, they will be believing it's because God doesn't love them. So there will be that shame that they'll be carrying out, which in itself is very easy to manipulate and weaponize. As we can see, they've weaponized that shame against our rainbow communities. But he's instead of helping these people to heal, he's teaching them to be further ashamed and traumatized.
Okay, so numbers for Destiny's Church. In a previous count, it was said that there are about 10,000 Destiny's Church members. On their website now, they are claiming to have around 2,000, stats from 2019. So they appear to be in decline. All this stuff about homosexuality and how Brian and Destiny's Church feels about all of that seems to be inconsistent. Because they hired this interesting individual, Jovan Golta, who's an openly gay man. They're happy to work with him, which is, I don't know if this was just a PR stunt. There were other things going on at the time. There was this Māori Carbon Collective thing that was going on, which funnily enough also included Hone Harawira, bringing him back into the story. Interesting, again, Hone Harawira posted a strange post criticizing the Takatapui community. He didn't say too much. He shared someone else's words, and I was glad to see that in the comment section, everyone rejected the post that Hone shared. But for Uncle Hone, it's interesting to see his name pop up in a few places, a potential few red flags showing here and there for Matua Hone. And this Javan Galta fella, he was hired as a campaigns manager, but just listen to this clip. He didn't last long. He ended up having a bit of an outburst and then he lost his job.
Rancid, rotten, stuffed pig.
Yeah, clearly I didn't think.
Do you often refer to women like that?
Don't think I've ever referred to a woman like that.
And a suicide reference, basically.
Yeah.
You fired that out in 10 seconds? Stylised like that?
Yeah, what's goes to show why it's why it looks like that, yeah.
Are you ashamed of yourself?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm not actually ashamed of myself for the fact of, you know, people are going to criticise you for that. I'm ashamed of myself just for myself. That, like, it wouldn't even matter if no one's seeing that, just knowing that I did that is, yeah, is not the sort of person that I'd like to think I am.
Why did you do it?
Sure, bro. Awkward. Okay, so what is ManUp? ManUp is just one of the many arms of Destiny's Church. I think it has less of the religious aspect, and it's more about men's health. Essentially, it's a men's health program designed to get men to open up, to talk about their emotions, which is a great thing. And how many members do they have? They give attendance here on their website, along with their sister Wahine equivalent of ManUp, Legacy. All of that together, they say they get about 718 participants every week. Okay, ManUp is headed by this individual, Kane Warren. Now, Kane is also a part of Destiny's Church's political arm. He is he is sitting for ManUp. And ManUp is operating in New Zealand, Australia, and apparently Cambodia. And when I was looking at these pictures from their ManUp Cambodia, I got to say, I was like, this is giving me Tim Jago vibes. Very much Tim Jago vibes. The Facebook page for ManUp Cambodia hasn't posted in about 5 or so years. So maybe they just say that they're operating in New Zealand, Australia, and Cambodia to kind of boost their numbers a little bit. Who knows? Now, the ManUp program doesn't receive government funding, but it does get itself into some interesting positions where it's able to promote itself to our vulnerable communities, such as in Otautahi, ManUp was given a stall at a local courtroom to promote their program. Now, I find this to be, of course, problematic. John Campbell had a really interesting interview with Kane, talking about controversies happening at the time. Brian Tamaki had done some awful things. He was trying to get into prisons. He really wanted to run his program in prisons. The government said no. Thank goodness. And then Brian Tamaki had a huge hissy fit. He threw his toys out of the cot. And so then the ManUp frontman, Kane Warren, came on Breakfast to kind of do some damage control. And I think John Campbell really nailed it in terms of this criticism that he's got. Listen.
That on the record, I really appreciate it. Kane, what the hell is your father-in-law playing at? I mean, if you're going to get into corrections facilities, and it's a tough question to ask you because you didn't say these words, but why would you threaten to provoke a riot? Why would you talk about a political gang rape in the context of being anti-violence? This is just reckless, isn't it?
I think it's the length of time and the frustration of consultations that we haven't had the opportunity to actually have any proper talks with corrections, particularly Minister Kelvin Davis. He hasn't replied to any letters.
Look, I'm sorry to interrupt, but isn't ManUp a movement about the ability to deal with frustration. In other words, if the man who inspired it and leads it, who is the figurehead leader, can't shut up and keep his cool when things aren't going his way, then what message does it send about the program?
I think he nails it right there. You know, it's true. Man Up is about being able to control your emotions. And Brian Tamaki, excuse me, has proven that he is incapable of doing that. And so here is another interview that took place with RNZ's Checkpoint with the Women's Refuge CEO. She cancelled a meeting with Kane. She was going to talk about them and their program, but then these comments that Brian Tamaki made about starting a prison riot came out, and we can hear more about it right here.
One of Brian Tamaki's tweets was about going into the prisons, and he was saying that they would plan private visits to inmates if they couldn't get in, and would cause inmate revolts in every prison. And then he goes on to say, "I'm warning you," which appears to be a reference to the government and Jacinda Ardern.
It's not a joke. That's the sort of thing that does incite violence, regardless of whether he thinks it's just words. It's not. People listen to those words.
He said he didn't really mean it in that way.
Rubbish. I don't believe that for a moment. He surely knew what he was saying. He uses words for a living.
He uses words for a living. Exactly. He does know exactly what he was saying. And, you know, he's always the one to push things up a notch. When it came to Te Atatū, he was the one who made the call, hey, I need you guys to storm the building, get in there and shut it down. You know, and he always says things like, oh, it's, you know, I didn't mean it like that, didn't mean it like that. But of course, they always know what they mean. And that's the scary thing in terms of how Brian is influential over a lot of people, particularly people in vulnerable communities. A lot of the things that he says is really quite scary. And considering he's trying to run this program about people controlling their emotions, you know, if there is something good about ManUp, if there is something that's beneficial, it needs to be separated. It needs to be separated from Destiny's Church, and Brian Tamaki needs to get as far away from it as possible. You know, there are individuals like this man here. I forget his name, but he has a good story in terms of how ManUp has helped him. And when you hear his story, basically what it sounds like was the thing that helped him was that he was brought into a space where he was encouraged to talk about his feelings. Encouraged to talk about his feelings, and that ManUp was the only space, the first space where he felt he was able to do that. Now, I am convinced that we can build spaces for our tāne to talk about their feelings, and it doesn't need to be wrapped in all of the negative bullshit that Destiny's Church and Brian Tamaki brings with it. There are great people even here in just outside of Otawa in Kaikohe, people that we know who are facilitating ManUp programs, who do a lot of awesome, amazing mahi. And after this week's protest, and when things die down a little bit more, I plan on talking to them and seeing what their perspectives are. And hopefully we can get a public statement from them. Hopefully they condemn what Brian Tamaki is encouraging. But, you know, we'll see how that one goes. And another thing, the controversies are endless, but during this time, another comment that was made, one of the Destiny's Church facilitators blamed an abuse victim for the abuse that she was receiving. So victim blaming an abuse victim. He was saying that, you know, if you provoke your partner, it's your fault.
Wow.
And of course that really upset the Women's Refuge CEO. I believe that's why she cancelled the interview with Kane. And another thing was that Brian Tamaki described Jacinda Ardern and Calvin Davis's response, saying that he can't go into prisons and that they're not going to help him. He described their response as a political gang rape. So, you know, he's the type of guy who is incredibly reactionary. He doesn't care about the impact of his words, and yet he is a preacher, right? It's outrageous. Another thing that was brought up in these interviews was, not that link, but another thing that was brought up was that members of ManUp have, since the Christchurch shooting, members of ManUp have been going outside of mosques with megaphones, targeting Muslims, saying that this is a New Zealand, this is a Christian country, and that there is something wrong with other faiths, and that they need to go home, etc., all of that kind of stuff. So all of these really nasty things wrapped around Destiny, ManUp. Not only do they shout outside of mosques, a lot of these ManUp members, but they also counter-protest our Palestine rallies. You know, the anti-genocide protests. They counter-protest them. Here's a short clip from Whakatū, from Nelson. Again, using our haka.
And young people.
And you know, an interesting thing in terms of how the media talked about these counter protests is they always just brought it up as a, there is a pro-Palestine and a pro-Israel group. But consistently, it has been ManUp who has manned those counter protests. And in the media reports, you never see that context or that association, that it's ManUp members running those counter protests, those pro-Israel protests. I'm not sure why they don't bring it up. It's as if they don't want the association between the two groups because each group makes each other look bad, or they don't want the pro-Israel protests to appear that they're just from one specific small group. What do you think, Samah?
Yeah, I think the Israeli lobby doesn't want the association with Destiny's Church. And as you say, they don't want to make it look small. Like, I remember early on when the news did vaguely put something out about the protests, because they stopped reporting on the protests altogether. Our news just ignores the fact that we have had, over a year and a half of weekly protests in towns, large and small, across this country, week after week after week. It's a massive protest movement, which as we'll see, they're responding to by recommending all these protest law changes. But the media has ignored the pro-Palestine protesters completely. And
Right.
I remember when they did very briefly cover them at the beginning, they would just say thousands of protesters turned up for Palestine and for Israel. And then they didn't tell you it was Destiny Church that was running the Israeli protests. And they didn't tell you that the pro-Palestine one had thousands, while Destiny Church had, maybe 100 people. They just sort of flattened it out and made it look like there were these two equal sides, when in reality, we have the people who are protesting out of a sense of morality and being against genocide and mass murder of human beings. And on the other side, people who have been brainwashed into supporting the Israeli lobby, into supporting the people committing the genocide, apartheid, and mass murder. And the media flattened it out to just look like it was just two equal groups of society that were both equally concerned about these two issues. That has not been the case. Israel has not had a mass protest movement for anywhere around the whole world. They've just used this Destiny Church groups to try and send out a few people to put out a message and intimidate the anti-genocide protesters. But you haven't seen this grassroots swelling up of a people's movement for Israel. It just simply does not exist. And so they had to manufacture one.
Kia ora. Thank you for that, Samah. Just coming back to this fella. So this is Toko Kopu. And when you learn about his story, he is a survivor from abuse in state care. And so that's his main kaupapa, is advocating for survivors of abuse in state care. And that's something that I find concerning about Destiny's Church and ManUp. Why are they not protesting against the state? Why are their numbers not being rallied and used to challenge the state? Why are they not being used to reinforce the demands that were in Te Whanake, the report around abuse in state care? And of course, abuse in state care and from faith-based institutions. Why is Destiny's Church not using his influence and his numbers to rally to challenge that, where I would say the majority of harm comes from in our society in terms of what tangata whenua suffer from? It's all the various pathways into prison, the institutionalization of our people. Instead, we see them counter-protesting the Palestine rallies. We see them teaming up with Julian Batchelor. It was a hilarious thing. Julian Batchelor, who ran, of course, the whites-only anti-Māori tour, misinformation tour about Te Tiriti across the country, where he was blocking predominantly Māori people at the door from entering. It was very interesting to see these two groups team up because, majority of Destiny's Church and Brian Tamaki's followers are Māori. And of course, Julian Batchelor's followers are white supremacists. And so they came together for this kaupapa. And I wasn't there on the day, but I heard from various people that it was an interesting dynamic watching the two groups mingle with each other at the end of the rally. Two groups that have a few things in common, but two groups who generally don't spend a whole lot of time around each other. Anyway, we'll move on. So another guy, this is the guy who was talking about who was outside the mosques. His name is Daniel Maxwell, and he makes a habit of shouting outside of mosques, targeting our Muslim communities. You'll also find him at Palestine rallies with a big New Zealand flag, of course. And this video is an interesting one. For some reason, he also decided to paint a mataora on his face. Maybe this guy's Matua Kahurangi, who knows? And he's a very interesting character, Daniel Maxwell. He is being supported by another group that ties in called the Free Speech Union. Okay, Samah, this is your area of expertise, I believe. You wanna take it over from here?
Sure. So yeah, let's start with Daniel Maxwell. Daniel Maxwell is renowned among activists in Aotearoa because he always shows up to disrupt, antagonize, annoy. As Pere was saying, he would stand outside of mosques and yell offensive things, stuff like that. So he's really well known, and he always shows up to the Palestine rallies to harass people. Eventually, one day he got arrested because the police told him to leave. He left, and he came back with a mask, and they arrested him. Now, the Free Speech Union decided to go out and bat for him, to defend him in court against the police. Not only him, but another person called Lucy Rogers, who was also arrested for antagonizing a pro-Palestine rally. And a third person, Paul Burns, who's an anti-abortion guy who just held up antagonizing signs that said something like, oh, there we go. $100 to the first person who proves that slavery is more evil than abortion. So that's the kind of guys that they are defending. And, two of them pro-Israel and this guy, an anti-abortion guy. And the Free Speech Union defends them in court, and then complaints are then made to the International Police Conduct Authority, or the IPCA. And the Free Speech Union, they've got a lot of resources. They've got a lot of time on their hands. And they actually win the cases against the police. The police drop the charges against Daniel. But they're not content enough with that. They want the Police Conduct Authority to do something about it. So the IPCA has a look at these complaints about Daniel and Lucy, and actually includes those two complaints as two of their three pieces of evidence that they based their latest report on, the IPCA recommendations, which, if implemented, would absolutely destroy our ability to protest, would absolutely dismantle our rights to free speech and the freedom of assembly in this country. It's the most horrific, has the most horrific consequences for our protest movements. And in this report, they have 3 case studies. One of them is the counter-protest to Posey Parker transphobe. 2 was Daniel Maxwell, the renowned agitator of anti-genocide protesters, and Lucy Rogers, who was another agitator of the anti-genocide protests. So they include those 2 that were complained about by the Free Speech Union. And the Free Speech Union is, by the way, really openly going out to bat for them if you go back. So if you have a look at that, they're really very happy and, even mocking the police.
It makes you feel, these guys make us feel sorry for the police.
Yeah, it's hilarious. They actually do, because the police just trying to do their jobs in these situations, and these guys just come after them. They complain, how dare you arrest our pro-Israel infiltrators, right? So the IPCA takes these 2 into account and is heavily influenced by the Free Speech Union. You can tell this throughout their writing. You can tell that in conducting this report and coming up with recommendations of how to change our protest laws, that behind behind their thinking were the complaints from the Free Speech Union, who were concerned not about the safety of protesters, of anti-genocide protesters who are being hassled and agitated by the pro-Israel. They were worried that their agitators, like Lucy Rogers, like Destiny Church's Daniel Maxwell, were being stopped by the police from harassing people. That's what they're worried about. And they're complaining to the police. They're complaining to the Independent Police Conduct Authority, or someone is on their behalf. And they are saying these people have a right to protest. They have a right to antagonize people. And you can tell that this is in the back of their thinking, because in the report, they've got a list of questions that are like their guiding questions for the report. And you have a look at the list of questions, and it's really telling. They say, when, if ever, is it reasonable to ask a counter-protester to leave a protest? When is it reasonable to disallow a protest on a main road to proceed because of the level of destruction it may cause other members to the public? When is it reasonable to ask counter-protesters to stand in a separate area from the protest? When, if ever, is it reasonable to remove a counter-protester's banner because of fear it will provoke violence by the main protest group? Is it reasonable to focus attention on the smaller of the protesting or the counter-protesting group because of the limited police resources? So, as you can see from those questions and from the case studies they use, because what they're talking about there are all except one are to do with those 2 counter-protesters that the Free Speech Union went out to bat for. All of them are examples of things that happen around then. Lucy Rogers, for example, was told to move and stand on the sidewalk instead of right next to the protesters, and when she didn't listen to the police advice, they arrested her. The other guy, they told him to put his sign or flag away, and then again, they're like questioning the legality of that. So you can see that Free Speech Union concerns for the counter-protesters are at the forefront of this report. What they conclude are the most draconian anti-protest recommendations you could possibly imagine. So they say, this is what they are recommending the law change to be, okay? From now on, if these recommendations go through, they're saying they want protesters have to notify police in advance of their protests, and that police can place any conditions that they want on your protest, and they'll arrest you if you don't follow the conditions that they put on your protest. They can also set new conditions or alter their conditions on the fly during the protest whenever they like. They can also, if your protest is going to be on a road, for example, they will do the traffic plan for you. And then they have a right, under these recommendations, to make you pay for the traffic plan that they write for you on top of it. It also makes it harder to arrest and deal with counter-protesters. For example, and I'm quoting them here, we've recommended that the offence provisions most commonly used to deal with the behaviour requiring enforcement intervention during protests, brackets, disorderly behaviour, breach of the peace, and obstructing a police officer, should contain carve-outs excluding them from use in public assembly environments. So they don't want the police to be able to arrest people at protests for disorderly behavior, breach of peace, or obstructing a police officer. And again, Lucy Rogers was arrested for breach of the peace, and Daniel Maxwell from Destiny Church was arrested for obstructing a police. So they're directly looking at those cases where the pro-Israel counter-protesters were arrested, and they're saying, hey, there should be carve-outs so that you can't use these reasons to stop our agitators in the future. Next, they say that police will now have the power to tell a protester to leave the protest if they want, and if they don't, they'll arrest them just because they want to. They also add no picketing at private residence, that one as well, very clearly targeting the anti-genocide protesters who have been very vigilant and protesting outside the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister's house, and doing it in a smart way where they swap out people so they don't get done for trespass law, for example, where they come and do it quickly and leave before the police comes, and so on and so forth. So they're directly suggesting this in response to the anti-genocide protesters. So if anyone tells you protest doesn't work, they're wrong, because they wouldn't be trying to kill our ability to protest if it weren't successful. And I think that's something that I've been reminded of myself. Another one they've put in is no impeding infrastructure. So impeding infrastructure with your protest is now an offence. And to clarify, such an offence would, for example, extend to the blocking of access to airports and railway stations, the blocking of key transport routes such as the Auckland Harbour Bridge. That seems very pointed, doesn't it? It seems pointed at the Hikoi recently, which went on the Auckland Harbour Bridge. They're saying that's going to be an offence now. You can't block critical infrastructure. And also they put a whole bunch of recommendations about how to spend more money training the police against us and teaching them anti-protest tactics, basically. So yeah, those are the recommendations, which are absolutely not workable, and we will most definitely not be putting up with it. And if they consider anything even remotely close to this in a bill form, we will certainly be on the front lines protesting. I will personally call a protest if need be, because this will be the most destructive thing to our protest movement that we've seen in this country and potentially forever, since colonization, of course. Yeah, the most destructive policy towards our freedom of speech and that we could possibly imagine happening. And what does the Free Speech Union think of it? They welcome the IPCA report. Of course they do, because it's based on their complaints very heavily. At the very bottom of this response, they do say something like, well, you know, we don't necessarily need new laws, and it's just about the police enforcing the laws properly. They just chuck it in at the end. But the main heading and the main brunt of their message is that they support the IPCA report. They should be shouting from the rooftops that this is the most free speech destroying recommendations they could possibly imagine. They should be screaming at the IPCA, no, we didn't mean for you to use our cases to further erode free speech. But they're happy about it. They're happy about the erosion of our free speech. Why is that? Because the Free Speech Union is, in fact, an Orwellian group. Their name is the opposite of what they do. They're actually about limiting our freedom of speech. That's their whole thing. And you can see it through the way that their complaints have led to these recommendations. You can see it in the fact that their co-founder, David Cumin, has been consistently trying to shut down the freedom of speech of other lecturers in this country. Him and others at the Israeli Institute of New Zealand, which David Cumin also co-founded, they've been attacking professors non-stop. In 2018, David Cumin attacked a professor called Nicholas Rowe. He said he affiliated with a terrorist group, and he pointed out that he pointed to something called an Israel Academia Monitor report, which outed the professor as being a self-identified terror sympathizer and had identified a number of concerning PhD topics. So there is this international group, Israel Academia Monitor, that looks at academics all around the world, and if they decide they're not pro-Israel enough, or they decide that they've been too outspoken about Israel, they target them. And then they have their local bodies like Israel Institute of New Zealand and all of the countries, all the corners of the world to do their dirty work for them on the ground as well. And that's where David Cumin comes into play. And so he's posting articles from 2018 attacking other professors and, tagging their employers, saying, should you be really hiring this person? This, of course, exasperated in 2023 after the Al-Aqsa attack. And, for example, they attacked, there's just been so many cases, but you have Mohan J. Dutta that they attacked. They tagged him in Israeli Institute tweets and called him an anti-Semite, an extremist. And actually this ended up threatening Mohan's safety in many ways, and he was getting death threats from people. And so this is the kind of pressure they're putting on academics, right? David Cumin again did it to, the Israeli Institute of New Zealand. They also open themselves up for complaints from students. So if a student sees something that's anti-Israel, they're encouraged to take it to the Israeli Institute of New Zealand to then target those people. And that's what they did to senior lecturer Philip Borrell at the University of Canterbury. They then went, and he's Ngāti Ranginui, Ngāti Tūwharetoa. He drew comparisons between the experience of Māori and Palestinians, and they went off at him, and they'd done OIAs for all of his lecture material so they could dissect it piece by piece and see if they can find anything to hold against him. Again, they did this to Jeremy Moses. The Israeli Institute of New Zealand tagged his employer on X. So we're not just talking about, them using their freedom of speech to attack others. They're actually trying to deplatform these people. That's why they're tagging their employers. They're actively trying to stop them using their freedom of speech. And, Jeremy Moses, he describes the kind of chilling effect that this has. He says that the Israel Institute thought it could intimidate me by tagging in my employer and demanding information about my lecture content was certainly eye-opening, and I can understand why many colleagues would not want to draw this kind of attention to themselves. So, because, if they're tagging your employer, if they're harassing you, if they're getting people to send you death threats, if they're, getting Twitter mobs to come and shout at you, and if you're worried about who's going to record what in the middle of your lectures and turn it against you, that is threatening. And that will get people to keep their opinions about what Israel's doing to themselves, just out of self-preservation. And that is the exact tactic of the Free Speech Union, their aligned Israeli Institute, and Destiny's Church that we see they're supportive of as well. That's their whole strategy, is to use any method that they can to intimidate us from using our freedom of speech to criticize the establishment, to criticize colonization, to criticize capitalism, to criticize genocide. They want to shut down our freedom of speech. And, they also did this with Stephen Rainbow, the Human Rights Commissioner. So they bring in a new Human Rights Commissioner, this government, right? And this guy, Stephen Rainbow, he's already known as a transphobe, and has, so it's ridiculous really that just even that we have a transphobe as the head of the Human Rights Commission. But he's also a major Zionist that's associated with the Free Speech Union. And the Free Speech Union put out this really open and honest press release immediately after it happened. He says, they say, well, Stephen Rainbow has been appointed the new Chief Human Rights Commissioner, a supporter and friend of the Free Speech Union, who has a strong background defending speech rights. In fact, he was one of the first cases we took on years ago when he ran into a spot of bother himself for raising concerns about the conversion therapy legislation that was going through Parliament. So they know this guy because they defended his ability to be a bigot back in the day. They defended him when he got into trouble for his comments against banning conversion therapy legislation. So yeah, they're always defending bigots, supporters of genocide. They've got a type, all right? They've got a type. And he's one of their mates. And he ends up being the chief human rights commissioner. And along with that as well, like, not just that, but they also get to put their friend as the race relations minister. And if you go back there, in that same press release, they say, I'm really excited to tell you guys something. Dr. Melissa Derby, a founding member of the Free Speech Union, has only recently resigned from her position from our council, has been made the Race Relations Commissioner. And then they say, this is interesting, in December last year, when applicants were being considered for these roles, I gave Paul Goldsmith a call suggesting Melissa to him, whom he didn't know at the time. It was a long shot, but one that paid off. So he gives Paul Goldsmith a call. Ring, ring. Hey, mate, I heard you were looking for a new race commissioner. I've got someone for you, this raging racist from the Free Speech Union. And Paul Goldsmith's like, sounds great. I can trust you. Actually, while I'm here, I also need a chief human rights commissioner. And the Free Speech Union's like, I got you, bro. And they fill both of these roles with their two extremely bigoted, extremely problematic Free Speech Union aligned, which also we know is aligned with the ACT Party. So their ACT Party and, you know, this general coalition aligned these individuals. They align. And
I maybe just say, you know, probably everyone watching this already knows, but all of the groups that we're talking about have all sorts of various alignments. They're all connected. You know, David Cumin, he's on the Free Speech Union. He's part of the Israel Society. The Free Speech Union and Taxpayers Union have all sorts of crossovers. Not only are they working together, but they're made by the same people, run by the same people. So guaranteed there's all this coordination going on. And it's also at the level going up to their influence on our politicians, giving them private phone calls to insert their own agents. It's crazy.
Yeah, so they're on that first call basis with each other. And like Pere said, they do actually all relate to each other on a high level as well. Like as that tweet actually says, that the Free Speech Union is part run by someone who's used to be in the ACT Party, and we know that Jordan Williams from the Taxpayer Union used to be in the National Party, and so on and so forth. So they control us on the streets, or they're trying to control us on the streets, and they're trying to control us through government by putting their people in government as well. But just as a funny little side note before I continue, you see how in their initial press release they say there, in December, we gave Paul Goldsmith a call, and it was a long shot, but he took our suggestion. Well, if you go now on their website to that same article, it's gone. That part about calling Paul Goldsmith is gone. They've removed it. I guess it was a little bit embarrassing admitting that Paul Goldsmith and this government is just so in the pocket of the Free Speech Union that they can just tell them what to do, and they'll just do it, even to their surprise. They took it out. I think that's, I don't know, I think that's kind of funny.
Hilarious.
Anyway, so they bring in Stephen Rainbow. And now Stephen Rainbow, he's not just concerning because he's part of the Free Speech Union and he's a bigot and he's pro-genocide. He's also concerning because what if he said in this article. So not sure if you've got it to bring it up, but he told, I think it was in a Stuff article. Oh, yeah, it should be that one. Yeah. So he told them that when it comes to the Middle East conflict, that it was fueling intolerance and division. And then he said, a particular group that's impacted by that, I know from personal experience, are Jewish people. And I think we need to be very careful about the impacts of that conflict on local people in New Zealand and making sure all people are kept safe. Now, I'm reading that line because during this time, I mean, this was right in the middle of genocide. And I'd never in my life seen so much hate and racism towards Arabs and Palestinians than I have during this genocide. And I mean, it was also playing out in real life, right? Like that little kid at the pro-Palestine protest getting hit by a hammer. You know, like we saw the Destiny Church, they were assaulting our Palestinian whānau and their allies. We were seeing online hate, you know, from his friends at the Free Speech Union, like David Cumin and people at the Israeli Institute, just the most horrific accusations, racism and, you know, intimidation they've ever seen against Palestinians and their supporters. But he says he's only worried about the impact of Jewish people in this country at this time, okay? Then he continues, how is he wanting to address this impact? He says hate speech would be addressed through other means, such as making sure some of the terrorist groups that operate in the Middle East are prescribed organizations. So he is thinking about how to control our freedom of speech. But because they don't want to use the word censorship, right? Because, you know, the Free Speech Union has made that a dirty word. He's going to try and do it through a backwards route, designating certain groups as terrorists. And you can see that he's done that since he's been in power. So initially, the government had designated Hamas as a terrorist organization. But more recently, they added Hezbollah, and they even added Houthis in the Yemen, the most honorable group of people you could possibly imagine, because they are actually defending against genocide. Holy shit, am I going to get in trouble legally for saying this?
No. Oh,
No,
well,
they're a
you never
designated
know.
terrorist
You never know.
organization. So yeah, Free Speech Union, they're probably going to clip this and send it to their mate to the Israel lobby to try and get me charged with something, probably.
Freedom fighters.
Like real freedom fighters. But anyway, the
Heroes.
Houthis, as a matter of fact, they've been fighting against the Israeli genocide the best way they can, by doing a blockade in the Red Sea to not allow Israeli-related ships to come through. When they do capture them, they look after the people on the ship. They tell them, you're one of our people. They honor them, feed them, and respect their dignity, which is more than we can say for Israel in the way that it treats its hostages. So they prescribe these groups as terrorists so that if anyone says anything they don't like online, they can find something on them, for example, supporting Houthis, supporting, the resistance fighters in Palestine, and say, these guys are supporting terrorism, we're going to get you done for that. So he's already doing the work in government of trying to control our freedom of speech. Even though he comes from the Free Speech Union, well, not even though, but because he comes from the Free Speech Union, which, as we know, is all about controlling our freedom of speech.
Kia ora.
And now with what Destiny has done, Free Speech Union did put some weak tweet here or there criticizing what Destiny Church done. But when it comes to what really matters, which is structural changes that can really weaken Destiny's Church, so for example, removing their charity status, here's what the Free Speech Union has to say.
There is a petition to remove Destiny's charitable status on the grounds it's not advancing a religious or community purpose by advocating these positions. What do you think about that idea? Because that would be financially damaging, of course, to Destiny Church for their position.
I think the concern is that people start defining what a church, in this instance, is allowed to be. And if you were to argue that churches can't protest or even have some sort of political element to them in that they might be campaigning on social issues, then we'd have to completely throw out any lessons learned from people like Martin Luther King. Now, I'm not comparing Brian Tamaki to Martin Luther King, but I would say that it's difficult to make a distinction at that stage because a lot of churches and religious groups have been involved in campaigning for social change. And so if they're going to go and do a protest, are you going to disqualify them, stop them from having charitable status because they've expressed that outrage in a public setting? I think it'd be very difficult to argue that legally.
Okay, so of course, absolutely no one is saying that we should remove their charitable status simply because of their views. We understand that a lot of fundamental churches have a lot of weird views, okay? And we understand that churches have political affiliations. I've not heard a single person say we should remove their charitable status because they have political affiliations. The reason people want to remove their charitable status is because he's openly inciting violence. He's openly inciting hatred and violence. And once it tipped over into that state of actually sending his people and explicitly saying, I want you to storm that room, that's inciting violence. That person should not be allowed to remain as a charity. And so I bring this up because, the Free Speech Union has made this post, not just a one-off tweet. They actually made a video post in defense of Destiny Church. So even though they're pretending like they are against the attacks that they did, they actually support them. We know this because they support them through court. If any of them get arrested for their pro-Israel antagonizing of the anti-genocide protesters, we know because they will come out and say, no, don't take their charity status because of this weird, twisty justification that we've come up with. So these guys, they love Destiny Church. That's my educated opinion on the situation. And not only that, but the situation in this country, I think I can summarize it as follows. We've got corrupt lobby groups like the Free Speech Union, like the Israel lobby, like the Israel Institute of New Zealand. And we can also chuck Destiny Church in there as a lobby group. They're able and enabled by the state, by our laws, to exploit vulnerable communities, like people who've just come out of prison, like people who've been abused in state care, to use them for their twisted ends. And then all of these lobby groups, they all work together to terrorize us during our protests and any public displays of resistance, whether it's resistance to the gender binary, whether it's resistance to colonization and genocide. They want to, and to use the Free Speech Union's word, inflict a thug's veto on us. So during the Julian Bachelor protests, Free Speech Union were coming at us constantly saying we're inflicting a thug's veto by protesting outside. And we kept telling them repeatedly, no, we are peacefully protesting outside. We weren't even blockading. We weren't trying to stop them entering. We weren't doing any funky business to try and stop the event. We were simply protesting as per our right. And even just that peaceful protest, they called that a thug's veto. They said that by antagonizing them and by being outside their protest, we're actually vetoing their ability to have their freedom of speech. Of course, they had no issue with the fact that they had a whites-only apartheid-like event. But putting all that to the side, they say that they have issue with thug's veto, but in fact, they are the ones using thug's veto against us. We know this because, you know, they're defending that Destiny Church guy, but I don't think that that's all there is in terms of their connection with Destiny Church.
You know, they're defending the groups that are trying, you know, these counter protests are trying to shut down the actual protests. Daniel Maxwell on his megaphone, he's trying to drown out other people's speech. The counter protests are all about shutting down those people's protests, shutting down their speech and their opinions. And then the Free Speech Union is backing up these guys.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, and you know, they support the Destiny's Church pro-Israel protesters to harass us, and they support Destiny's Church doing this. They like it. They like the division. It distracts from capitalism. It distracts from the real issues like we talked about at the beginning of this, you know, with the few extremely powerful millionaires and billionaires controlling our whole country, hoarding the vast majority of the wealth while the rest of us suffer over scraps. And it benefits them that we're divided. It benefits them that we're arguing about queer ideology instead of capitalism. It suits them that, you know, aspects of Māori culture are depicted in a negative way because the Māori movement represents the greatest force of resistance to the capitalist colonial state. It suits them that people who have a lot of energy, who have a lot of passion, and have a lot of anger, to channel that anger towards our own vulnerable communities instead of against, as Pere said, the state. Instead of these people learning to heal and control their emotions and channel them in a way that is constructive and can channel the institutions that harmed them in the first place, they are in fact harming themselves and others and forcing those vulnerable people to stay in that cycle of trauma. And that's what I think all of those groups benefit, whether they explicitly work together or whether they just opportunistically work together. It doesn't really matter. What I can see in front of me is enough evidence that they do in fact work together. You know, you chuck in Julian Bachelor as well into that mix, and it's just one big group of people who are trying to fight the vast majority of us using pretty much any tool that they can, whether it's putting their people in government bodies like the Human Rights Commission, whether it's sending thugs to shut down our protests, and whether it's intimidating academics from using their freedom of speech. And, you know, I will just address that one comment about the Posey Parker protest. They were like, oh, you didn't say anything about that. Well,
Kapo.
I did think that protest went too far, and I thought that was the police's problem. It wasn't because we didn't have enough laws. The police should have created a barricade and stopped people from entering the barricade. At one stage, when I saw a lot of people breaking the barricades and getting really close to those people because they were outnumbered, for me personally, and I'm not the type to criticize other protests, especially when they're facing against someone that is actually threatening their existence with their words, that is saying extremely hateful and dangerous speech, right? Because that's a context that needs to be played, that needs to be understood in the situation. But for me, when I did see that barricade was down and then there was a lot of people, thousands of people, and a small group of them, I did start to get a little bit anxious, and I started to think I would have preferred if we had just maintained a distance, kept disrupting them with our noise, but maintain that distance. And yeah, I also would not have thrown tomato on someone, like, because for us, like, we organize protests, and like the protests that we organized against Julian Petrel, we chose not to do it in a disruptive way that we were blockading them. We chose not to do anything physical in nature, and the biggest reason for that is just protection of our protesters. It's not not because I have any issue with someone throwing tomato at Julian Petrel morally, but because we do want to protect our protesters and we want to keep it sustainable. We want them to be able to come back to another protest, not to be traumatized or arrested and then unable to come back. And so we do try our best, and despite that, oftentimes people get arrested anyway, by the way. And I wanted to say that before on the report, they complained about those those two pro-Israel protesters being arrested, right? Well, we have so many stories of unjustified arrests of our people.
Yeah. And, on the Posey Parker point, the fact that there was going to be a protest and a counter-protest and whatnot, that was on breakfast TV. It was on mainstream TV. It was very well organized. The police knew exactly what was going to happen. Why did they not have a presence on the ground that day? Why did they not have a presence knowing, this was a person who was being barred from the country. There was all this kerfuffle around bringing her in. She was finally allowed in. And then a huge amount of people, why did that protest and the counter-protest just go ahead without police involving themselves? And they normally would. So, it's, we said it before, do these things, are they all in on it together in some kind of crazy web of conspiracies, or does it just all play out like this and these groups jump on it? Who knows? But we know that the Free Speech Union, they previously supported two people who were barred from the country as well, Stefan Molyneux and Lauren Southern, I believe. That was when the Free Speech Union was created, to defend these bigots and to defend
white supremacists.
These white supremacists. I don't know who it was who invited Posey Parker to the country, but I think they knew that they were going to get a response. And as Samah said, we are always very careful in terms of how we organize protests. We're not amazing. We're not professionals. We don't know really what we're doing, but we always do know that when you retaliate, it will be used against you. And I think it's something we all need to be mindful of. If you lash out in the way that they want you to, it is going to be used against you, against all of us. The Posey Parker incident, in terms of the report that we were talking about before from the IPCA, whatever they're called, they used the Posey Parker evidence as a core part of why they're doing their report. And so I understand why the tomato sauce was thrown. If I felt that my community was being directly attacked and that this violent individual has been allowed into the country despite all of us pushing back against it, I understand the frustration coming out, and I understand, and I think it was permissible that it happened. Is it something that I would have done personally myself? Probably not.
Yeah, and and just to add to that the states will clamp down on us whether we do it or not. But these things, they will use them to speed up that process. That's all, and it's not that we should do what they want us to do, but we should just be quite thought through with how we're going to resist. And like Pere said, just make sure that when we do lash out, it's not in a way that fits into the paradigm of how they want us to lash out, and to, surprise them a little bit. But yeah, that's not, so for the people, who criticize us often for having double standards, we don't. We are non-violent consistently, and
Just laughing at this comment from William Medidi. So how do you beat them, bro? It's difficult, you know. We're playing such a messed up game, you know. The state has their knee on our neck, you know, and we have to do our best to respond in a way where we don't upset all of the people sitting on the fence who are just watching. You know, we have to respond with civility. We have to respond, you know, in a way that's not going to then give those who have their knee on our neck a right, a justification to push even harder. You know, we have to be creative in our responses to how we protest. We have to be innovative. We do have to be innovative. We have to beat them at this game of innovatively getting across our points. We have to express ourselves in various ways that engage the public through things like haka, through things like waiata, through things like art. Those are the ways that we win, I believe. We lean into our culture, we lean into the beautiful aspects of our culture, we lean into our tikanga, we lean into our stories, the beautiful aspects of the things that we're trying to defend. We focus on those things. Like for Palestine and for Te Ao Māori, I think what have been some of the strongest things for us is sharing stories about our culture, just living our culture, just speaking Te Reo Māori, just engaging in kaupapa Māori, living our culture and helping it to sustain itself for future generations. Now, of course, there's urgency for what's going on in the world. It feels like we need to respond to something right now, and we have to be drastic. It's dire. But when you sit in that mentality a lot, that's when you start to lean into these ideas of, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll do this, maybe I'll do that. Things that you maybe shouldn't do if you weren't thinking with the urgency mindset. You know, we're very reactive. We need to kind of try and chill that out so that we can be more strategic in the ways that we respond. The state wants us to react in that way. You see it with Daniel Maxwell and all of these individuals who come and they antagonize protesters so that they lash out, so that the police can further clamp down on what we're doing. How do we win? We may not ever win. That is a reality of something that we need to swallow. We may not ever win. And maybe our purpose on this planet is just to last for as long as we can. Because, you know, we're fighting capitalism. We're fighting the assimilation of all cultures coming into this big melting pot of nothingness, you know? I don't believe, like, it's not hope that keeps me going, to be honest. I think if you're holding on to hope, I think, you know, there is a potential that you're going to be let down. I don't do what I do because I have a hope. I do what I do because I know it's the right thing to do. And whether or not we're going to win, you know, winning for me is not necessarily the end goal. For me, the goal is to simply communicate our stories, to be as just as possible. Because if you go any other way about it, it's not going to be sustainable. It's not going to be real. You know, we do have to take the patient approach to this. Lashing out is just going to make things worse. I don't mean to be a downer. It sounds pretty negative what I'm saying, but when I reflect on successful strategies that we can all employ, I'm always thinking about the need for us to be more patient. And, you know, I am a protester. I'm an activist. I love getting out on the streets and yelling, but it's really the backroom stuff. You know, we need to be engaging our people in local elections, not just the general elections. We need to be encouraging people to build their own resilience as individuals, for people to have self-sufficiency in their lives, for strong family connections to exist, for families to be working together, for communities to be working together for self-sufficiency per every community. How do we win? You know, it's a hard question, but it's definitely not from doing what the state wants us to do, which is lashing out.
And, you know, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do radical things, you know, like one of my favorite protests for Palestine was actually them blockading the port in Auckland. So, you know, that's an extremely disruptive protest, because it costs them a lot of money to not be able to use the port, even for a short amount of time. And during that protest, just to add that one of the young people that was there was walking away from a police, and he tackled him head first onto the concrete. It was terrifying. Luckily that guy was okay. But, just to note that the IPCA doesn't take issue with those arrests of Palestinians, those violent arrests. They only take issue with the pro-Israel arrests. But anyway, my point just to say that we support radical actions that are thought through and that are designed to really disrupt the system so that we're not wasting our illegal moves. You know what I mean? We plan what we're going to do to breach the law together in a way that's actually going to disrupt the system in some meaningful way. That's just my humble opinion as a new, semi-new activist into the space. But we want our actions to actually disrupt them, not just to express some of our energy in a short, quick time. There's also time and place for that, right? Like protests, so like marches. It's just good for us to come together as one and to express something. But we also need to think ahead for some planned actions that actually get in the way of the system running things. So whether that's blockading a port or blockading Queen Street or an occupation, like, currently there is an occupation that we should also probably put out there. But just to make the point that we are for radical action.
Of course, yeah. And I didn't mean to say that it's that non-violent actions are the only way. Just look at what's going on in Palestine. Of course, not criticizing their freedom fighters for self-defense and things like that. But we do have to be creative here in Aotearoa. We have to do something that disrupts the state, but that also brings the public along with us. If we're not bringing the public along with us, then these other groups that engage with them, in their suits, with their decorum and their glasses of water and whatnot, those who are on the fence, who don't have all of the context and maybe don't understand what's going on, if we're not bringing them along with us, then these groups will, like Destiny's Church, Free Speech Union, Taxpayers Union, etc., 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 these groups look for those people to pick up. The ACT Party is looking for popular talking points that resonate with the majority of the population. So we have to be creative, we have to be innovative, and we have to try and bring everyone with us. Otherwise, it's going to come back and bite us in the ass.
Thanks, Peter. That's beautiful.
Oh, cool.
I have to say that Pere has really helped me in the way that I view our activism. And, for me, like, I used to a lot more than now struggle with the idea that we're just never going to win. And, just look at what they did to my country, Iraq. It's just completely devastated and there's no justice. And it's hard to have hope after that you can change things. But Pere has convinced me that we don't need to have...
I won an argument with my wife. Okay, we should probably wrap this up.
I didn't finish my point.
Oh, aroha
He got too excited because I said he made a good point. Okay, anyways, the good point is that we don't need to have hope that we're going to change things in our lifetimes. We only need to have hope that we will contribute to changing things in our lifetimes.
Kia ora. Beautiful. Beautiful. Indeed, we do it because it's the right thing to do, right? We are just answering questions at the moment, so maybe we should wrap up. But have really enjoyed this. I hope people enjoyed this episode. Don't forget the protest on Sunday, 2 p.m. at the Mount Albert Park Rotunda, I believe it is. We'll put some information about it on our stories anyway. But please do get along to it. Think about creativity and innovation and bringing people along with you. But I have full support and faith in Papa, those who are running the activation, the rally. So do listen to their guidance. And Rarotonga. Rarotonga, of course, the occupation going on in Rotorua. I'm not exactly sure where things are at with Rarotonga, but we'll put some information on our stories about it. Do look up Rarotonga, find them on Instagram, support them, like their page, like their posts, learn about the kaupapa, very interesting, very important one that's going on. And thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks for not leaving us alone during these shows. Really, really appreciate you coming on live, like seriously.
Thank you. I just have to say it as well. If you do want to support the mahi that we do, we have a page where you can put through donations. Just look for Ko-fi, search Ko-fi on Google, our name, Aotearoa Liberation League, and you'll find links on there to be able to donate to us. On there, you'll also find in the description our bank account number if that's how you prefer to do it. We provide all of this information, all of this mahi that we do for free because we believe in it, but people's support will really help us to be able to step things up, to be able to produce our content faster, and just so that we can be more organized, so that I don't get lost in my notes, and so that I can actually deliver a show. Samah does it you do it so amazingly. I hope that I can get more like you one day, but
compliments.
But anyway, again, e hoa ma. Thank you so much again for coming.
Love you all.
Looking forward to another episode next week.
Yeah, I'm already excited.
Apparently we never have anything to do on Fridays. To be honest, we didn't want Fridays to be the night that we did our stream, but it just happened, and now we're like unable to change. But it's
good. It's all good, no?
We'll see how things go. But anyway, Paul Marie, e hoa ma, have a great night. Maybe soon we should do just a Q&A kind of session.
Yeah.
Where we do just take, because we call ourselves leftists, but like the left is pretty like bad. All big majority groups are bad. Just we criticize leftists a lot, and I think people would probably appreciate a bit more of that kōrero, because I know, it's hard for groups to criticize themselves. But I think it's a good thing to do for us to criticize ourselves and to analyze ourselves. So maybe we should run a bit of a session with some of our friends and others from the space to get some real critical thinking going around some of our strategies and things like that. It's something that we would like to discuss more and dive into more, but
totally. We talk about our enemy a lot, but really we should be talking about ourselves and how to strengthen our own movements, right? But yeah, we'll get there. We're still babies. We're still growing in our wisdom and what we should be putting our energy into.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, and of course, yeah, if you have feedback for us, if you think, this and that was off base, or that you didn't appreciate XYZ types of messaging, we love that kind of feedback. We're pretty stubborn in the way that we like to portray things and our style and delivery of things. We are pretty stubborn in that sense, but we do take on feedback, especially if it is a consistent theme. But yeah, we're keen to work more with people in terms of developing the stream and the content that we create. And so if you have skills, or if you think there's a space for you in the league, send us a message, and we can talk about it and we can explore possibilities. Anything else from you, Samah, before we say goodnight?
No, that's all. I agree. Solidarity is important in these times. That's probably the most important thing, just to show up. And so please do show up at the protest if you can this Sunday. That's all for us tonight. Thanks, folks. Thanks for joining.
Bye-bye.
See you next week.
Paul Marie.
Paul Marie.
Have a great night, everyone. Thanks again for coming.
Ka kite.
Mauri ora.